Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you for having me. So some of you are familiar faces. For those who aren't, I'll go through a bit about who I am. But before I do that, I want to start with talking about National Reconciliation Week, because I'm really thankful for being asked here today to talk about this project in National Reconciliation Week. It's held every year from the 27th of May to the 3rd of June, and those dates aren't just two random dates. They actually mark two key milestones in Australia's reconciliation journey. So the 1967 referendum, which recognised Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the census, and then the 3rd of June in 1992 was the Mabo decision, which recognised native title. So they're two really important dates. And it's a time for all of us to really reflect on the shared history that we have, to celebrate the progress and to think about and renew the commitment that we want to build these respectful relationships moving forward. The theme for this year is bridging now to next, and it's about learning from the past, standing in the present that we're at right now, and taking active steps towards a better future together. And I think it really reminds us that reconciliation is a journey, and it's one that requires all of us to work together and walk together to keep moving forward. The artwork this year is also really symbolic. It's done by a Kalkadoon woman, Bree Buttonshaw, and it's got native plants in it which symbolize strength and resilience and renewal, because a lot of our native plants need those really adverse environments of fire to be able to grow and renew and become something new. So showing us how we can grow even through adversity. Like I said before, reconciliation hasn't always been a straight path. There's been some really great progress, but there's also been some really painful setbacks. But reconciliation, I think, doesn't live just in policies. It lives in our actions, it lives in our hearts and in our relationships. And each of us has a role to play. So whether that's through conversations, education, or actions within your community, I think we all can contribute to a more united and respectful Australia just across the board. So I want that to kind of be the framing for this project and what I'm going to talk about. So I guess the first thing is kind of who am I? I'm Eliza. I'm a farm girl that grew up on a farm at the back of Bourke, growing up on the Barker River just south of Tilpa, going to school over a two-way radio for School of the Air in Broken Hill. I've seen the river at its highest. I've seen the river mostly at its lowest or completely empty. At the moment, it's very full. We've got a lot of flooding that's happening out there at the moment. These photos are from the weekend just past. I completed my undergraduate and honours in marine science, which makes a whole lot of sense when you grow up during never-ending droughts in the middle of, the desert. But then I headed up to Alice Springs to head up a small research team looking at desert ant behaviour. I think I really missed the heat. After that, I moved to Brisbane, where I worked on missile and anti-missile technology for DARPA by modelling the behaviour of aggressive bees as they tracked moving targets. And then I finally went to Canberra to complete my PhD in behaviour and ecology of native ant species. After this, I then came to Sydney, beginning my postdoc at USyd with Tanya Laddies, that some of you may know. And then I eventually moved into professional roles, which most recently was as the Biodiversity Management Officer in the Sustainability Strategy. Now I'm working for a consultancy called Water Technology, which I know some of you are also familiar with. And I've taken on a role there as a senior ecologist that kind of specialises in science communication, as well as working in Indigenous and community engagement. And I think when I look back at the path I've taken to get where I am, it always seems a little chaotic from the outside, but from the inside, it's really been driven by a deep desire to learn and to have a meaningful impact on the things that I care about. And so it's at this moment I would really like to acknowledge where I have come from. So I'm originally from Barkindji country, and I really think that what set me on the path to where I am today was the influence of a really great man, Uncle Bruce Redman. So Uncle Bruce was a Barkindji man who decided, for whatever reason, to share his knowledge with me. So each day out on the farm, at some point, Uncle Bruce would turn up, ready to show me something new, from how to catch pythons, which my parents were thrilled about, to patiently watching spiders take down and respin their webs, to watching the flood front come rushing down the river. There was always something new to learn and something for him to show me. So I want to pay my respects to Uncle Bruce, without whom I doubt I would be where I am today. And I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present of the country I come from, the country I live on, Dharawal country, and the countries I work and play on. To give you a little bit of an idea of where we're going, I'll go through a bit of a background to the project, a little bit on the history of the area, how we co-designed this and what our co-design looked like. And I'm hoping that throughout all of this, you'll start to get an appreciation of why these projects matter. So the development of the Darubban, which is the name of the Hawkesbury River, cultural restoration strategy and activities. To understand the development of the restoration strategy, we need to have a bit of background on something else called the Coastal Management Program. So in order for the New South Wales government to plan for development and to protect environmental assets and manage coastal hazards across the state, they developed the New South Wales Coastal Management Framework. And that included changes to legislation and planning policy to provide a framework for coastal management that would be integrated and consistent across the state. It's underpinned by New South Wales legislation, including the Coastal Management Act, the Environment Planning Assessment Act, and the Marine Estate Management Act. And it's then also supported by strategies and policies and frameworks, including the Coastal Management Manual, the Coastal Management State Environmental Planning Policy, and the Marine Estate Management Strategy. And then all of that to become delivery and implementation of these programs. So the Hawkesbury Nepean River Coastal Management Program started as a scoping study in 2020, followed by identifying the risks and vulnerabilities and opportunities, combined with community consultation and technical studies to get a really solid picture of the state of the waterway. The CMP itself for the Hawkesbury Nepean, the study area encompasses the tidal section of the river, Pittwater, Brisbane Water and Broken Bay. So it's that tidal area from Yarramundi all the way down to the estuary entrance at Box Head and Barrenjoey Head. So water technology actually came on board in the development of the Coastal Management Program for the final final 3 stages of this 5-stage of the CMP. So stage 3 to evaluate the management options and identify what they were, and also then stage 4, prepare the CMP for exhibition and adoption by the 6 councils involved. And you can see the 6 councils there. It's Hornsby, Central Coast, Hawkesbury, and the others. So these steps have involved really significant community consultation, and especially the identification and consultation of all the First Nations groups within this area. And that really started the relationship between WaterTech and First Nations groups in the Hawkesbury. So within that extensive engagement, getting out and talking to people, we were able to identify 5 possible Indigenous management options that fit into this coastal management program. So just 5 actions that fit alongside a whole bunch of other actions. And these options then had strong synergies and overlap with the plan for the development of the cultural restoration strategy, with potential that the actions within this management plan could get funded and implemented underneath this restoration strategy. So the main point here is that this is a management program that covers all of kind of the actions that are happening along that river system, and it's the responsibility of these 6 councils. When we then go into the cultural restoration strategy, so the CMP before, and now we're talking about the CRS, this is being developed by New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development. And this project is set kind of to the side or adjacent to the CMP, the Coastal Management Plan. So the work from this one is really has been informed by the work that we've done in the CMP, especially in the development of actions relating to river health, cultural assets, and that connection to country. And due to the extensive groundwork that we've done with the CMP, the management program, the development of the Indigenous actions, we had a solid base to begin the development of this strategy. So this strategy differs in that it's designed to guide the management of the Aboriginal cultural landscapes in the Hawkesbury River estuary, and that's its sole focus. And so within that, we were able to actually identify 28 Indigenous management actions that could be carried out to eliminate or mitigate the key threats to the cultural sites and country in the Hawkesbury Nepean River system. So that's like flood damage to the middens or loss of traditional knowledge and access to sites. So it was as much about building resilience into the estuarine system and the capacity of Aboriginal people to manage cultural sites and care for country. It's as much about that as it was about improving the condition of those cultural assets, especially those damaged in the recent flooding events from 2020 and 2022. The process was also split into two projects. So the first was that development of the cultural restoration strategy. The second was the development of shovel-ready activities with First Nations groups that would then be funded under the NEAP program to be completed by the end of financial year. And so then we come over to this sort of messy side. So we have the Coastal Management Program, which is run by all the responsibility of the 6 partner councils that are involved. It's much broader, much larger. There's lots of different actions, and there's only 5 identified Indigenous management actions in that one. Then we have the Restoration Strategy, which is New South Wales DPIRD. That's a much narrower scope. The actions are only related to Indigenous management, of which we developed 28 through that engagement with community. Related to that is this sort of base funding opportunity, and that's the New South Wales Estuary Asset Protection Program, the NEAP program, and that approved $64 million in funding through the riparian stabilisation package. So that was to provide, it then also under one of its actions, provided specific funding for the protection of cultural assets and for the development of further actions with the CRS and funding actions identified in the CMP. So this body down the bottom, this program, was able to provide funding for each of these 2 different program and strategy to start being implemented. The thing that I want to focus on in my story, once we get through all of this, is what we've been calling the activity sheets. And the activity sheets would be funded by the funding coming out of NEAP, but they would be framed and they would be sort of shaped by those management strategies that we've developed in the management program and in the restoration strategy, and would sort of present themselves as stage 1 of the cultural restoration strategies, with the idea that whatever else was in the restoration strategy would then build upon and keep funding these stage 1 activities. And then after that, there's also the potential that the restoration strategy is actually an avenue for funding for the coastal management program. So I guess the really long-winded thing about all of this is that local and state government natural resource management can be messy, and often it's trying to do the same sorts of things without really talking to each other that much. But more importantly, I really think that the history of engagement for the development of the coastal management program that WaterTech had allowed me to begin with a deeper conversation about immediate actions with the First Nation groups we've been talking to. So there was some history and trust there to get us started. I was working in the Upper Hawkesbury for my projects in partnership with Mirrabooka. They're a leading Darug Aboriginal social enterprise in Western Sydney, and they provide the local Indigenous community with employment, education and training. They have 3 core services. So one is celebrating culture through awareness programs and activities, training and education. Then they have caring for community with financial counselling services, no interest loan schemes and energy account payment assistance. And then they have their caring for country, which is providing landscaping, arboriculture, native plant nurseries, and conservation management services for state and local governments and for businesses and organisations. And this last section, the caring for country section, is what I think they're really known for in the realm of asset management. So any projects that we could develop within sort of a bush regeneration angle would have a high likelihood of success. The history of engaging with groups like Mirror for the development of the coastal management program meant that we were building upon those kind of existing relationships and really demonstrating, I think, the value of continuing engagement across projects and across communities. And one of the things I guess I'm really trying to highlight is that you can't put a price or a number of hours on that kind of connection. The continuity of connection really matters. So as I said before, I was working in the Upper Hawkesbury, which is from Wiseman's Ferry down to Yarramundi. And together with the team at Mirror, Uncle Wayne, Uncle Daryl, I think might be on the line, and Jazz, we developed 4 projects, 2 that were sort of business as usual for Mirror at Wiseman's Ferry and at Cat-Eye Reserve. So up here at Wiseman's and down at Cat-Eye. And then 2 that we were really excited for that were a step outside of that sort of business as usual approach. And that was one at Hope Farm at the National Park, and then a 4th project that we kind of called Waterculture. But before I get to the details, I feel like we really need to take a step back. So this region holds really deep cultural significance and has long been a place of resistance, survival, and continuity for First Nations people, which, when working with First Nations people, I think you should really understand the history and the context. So I'm going to set the context and the history of this region for you, which I hope will really underscore the significance of our projects. So working with Indigenous groups can be challenging. It can be hard, especially where areas are contested, and there isn't really an easy answer to this, but I think understanding why it's hard can be really helpful. The first thing I think to understand is that it's often misunderstood that First Nations people were all the same people, when in reality, all these different language groups, some with different dialects within language groups, functioned like individual countries. So that's where talking about country comes from. And the part of our acknowledgement of country is to highlight and respect that ongoing connection of Indigenous people to country and our connections as well. So I'm from Barkindji country, but I live on Dharawal country. So just as Europe is made up of many nations, Australia in its pre-colonial and continuing cultural landscape, we were also made up of many nations. And that means that often at many locations, there's going to be more than one clan that needs to be a part of the process and a part of the conversation. And just as with countries sharing borders, there's a lot of politics between different groups. I mean, you get the same with neighbours in the same apartment block. The second thing I think is to understand around the impacts of colonisation to those clans, which requires a bit of learning from the past. So Australia's history doesn't just begin in 1788. First Nations people have been here for over 65,000 years. They're the oldest continuing culture on Earth. And to make this a little bit simpler, I guess, I want to represent it visually to hopefully drive home the length of time our First Nations people have been understanding and caring for our environment. So here on my beautifully decorated by my toddler ruler, 1 centimetre will be about 1,000 years. And for simplicity, we'll cut it at 60,000 years ago, but you get the point. There's an extra 5,000 years before that. So this timeline highlights some of the key moments. There are many more, but for simplicity, I've just picked a few. The oldest evidence of tools that predate humans appearing in Europe, of art, of ceremonial burials and cremations, the oldest evidence of treating the dead with respect and storytelling, of the development of trade and agriculture and bread, of pastures, of fish traps, of local economies and land management like coal burning. This, to me, represents the most extensive database that's ever been created. First Nations people didn't need to write this knowledge down because they were and are the best science communicators, instilling responsibility, understanding, and curiosity into every generation as they grew. All of this happened before horses were domesticated, lasting longer than the Bronze Age, lasting longer than the empires of Rome and Nubia, longer than the 100-Year War. All this time, Indigenous people were in Australia, learning and listening to the environment, to manage it, to care for it, to live in balance with it. And if anyone understands this country we stand on, it's our First Nations people. But after colonisation, we saw the disruption of this connection in this tiny little bit down the end here in the green. People were displaced, wiped out, and 65,000 years of history was almost forgotten. Of particular importance to where I was working was the impact of the Hawkesbury and Nepean Wars. So I want to dig into this just a little more to give the context, because here we see how long First Nations people have been here and interacting and understanding the environment, but I want to look a little closer at the wars of the area where I needed to work. So to bring this to a timescale that's something a bit more modern, here we look at today back to the arrival of the First Fleet. So, showing my age, 40 years ago, I was born. 50 years ago, colour TV made it to Australia. Yet colour TV didn't make it into my family home until I was about 10. 80 years ago, the Second World War ended, and my granddad returned to Australia after spending most of his deployment as a prisoner of war in Changi. His experience profoundly impacted my family and my childhood, as the war did for millions of families around the world. In 1901, we have the Federation of Australia, and that same year we have the White Australia policy enshrined in law, which aimed at not only stopping what was termed alien-coloured immigration, but to, at the earliest time, deport or reduce the numbers of aliens now in our midst. This policy wasn't completely eliminated until the 1970s and the introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975, the same year as colour TV made it to Australia. If we keep going back, BHP begins mining in Broken Hill, a town that as a child my family had to leave as the lead levels in mine and my sister's blood was dangerously high. So that's 140 years of extraction that's still impacting people today, with health impacts felt by many, including my siblings. These are just a few events that have had a significant impact on one life, on my life. During this time, the Frontier Wars were underway, and these were the violent conflicts between First Nations people and European settlers, generations of resistance from Indigenous peoples against the expansion of European settlement. The Hawkesbury and Nepean Wars occurred early on, not surprising given the proximity to those early settlements, but the impact has been felt for generations. These wars happened at the same time as the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, and yet they've not been officially recognised by our government. And this is not due to a lack of evidence. The wars are well documented in church writings, in notebooks of Governor Phillip, of police officers and military men, particularly the published books of Watkin Tench and William Dawes, who were both tasked with carrying out the bounties on Indigenous people in the region. And these weren't just skirmishes, they were acts of invasion and resistance. They're foundational to understanding how colonisation disrupted Indigenous life and why that disconnection still has consequences today. These wars cut the ties that Indigenous people had in the Hawkesbury region with their lands. These wars broke apart families, decimated the population, erased knowledge, and are a really important part of the complication of engaging today. So this information sat heavy with me as I thought about this project. I know we can't right the past wrongs, but we can shape the future. So aiming for something meaningful, more than just business as usual, was always my goal. And how can we bridge now to next? The next step was walking country and being part of genuine conversations, of sitting by the river, talking and deeply listening. So no computers, no phones, no meeting rooms, just us, Ngara and Durubban. These conversations were personal. They were about our communities, about our families, our desires. They weren't transactional at all. And they were about creating space and a time to connect. There wasn't a time limit on these conversations. And that was to be able to hear the truths that aren't always told in those really structured consultations. This process of yarning, of being together on country, was really critical. I felt it allowed Uncle Wayne and Uncle Darryl to speak and me to not only listen to them, but to hear what they were saying. And what I heard again and again was that people felt disconnected, physically, spiritually, and culturally, that colonisation brought disconnection. So we talked about that. The wars, the displacement and death and the loss of land and access, that it broke the ties that had existed for thousands of generations. So this is the river going through Richmond and Windsor, and much of the riverbank is now privately owned. It's fenced off, it's inaccessible to the communities that belong to it, with only tiny pockets of access. So there's a couple of national parks in the yellow and some parks in orange, with a swimming conditions map to tell you if it's safe to swim with the current pollution levels. There's also very little post-contact documentation of Darubbin's cultural and ecological significance. So Murrumbidgee are well known for their bush regeneration work. So those types of projects were an easy starting point. But in these conversations, we saw a much deeper opportunity emerge, a chance to really reconnect people with the river, with Darubbin in a meaningful way. And so that's what we aimed at. By reconnecting with Darubbin, we can reconnect with identity, with knowledge, and with belonging. And we had an opportunity to pitch something that wasn't just about conservation or weeding or revegetating, it was about reconnecting. And so from those conversations and shared experiences, the project was born. It was grounded in those community priorities. It was led by a cultural authority, and it was really centered on healing. I think a core theme to Indigenous creation stories are centred around waterways. They're at the heart of so much of Indigenous life, of story and science, survival and ceremony. And so the approach we had was a really blended approach of combining traditional knowledge with contemporary research to get out on the water, to get on boats and rediscover and map important cultural sites along the river, and to look at them from a new angle. Maybe they haven't been seen from the river for a while or at all. So being able to give that new vision and new angle on these really important sites. We wanted to find what's been missing for generations and what hasn't been visited and reconnect with it. The projects included conducting on-country experiences, so getting on boats and on the water or going out on foot, to listening and observing, and then identifying and documenting in that very rigorous standard scientific way these sites so that they can be protected. And I think the outcomes go far beyond the data collection. So it's about cultural revival. For some of these elders, it's the first time and potentially the only time they'll ever be able to get on the river. So this project really offered Darug elders and traditional owners a rare and meaningful opportunity to reconnect with Darubbin physically and culturally and spiritually. By travelling along the waterways, they can explore really intimate areas of the river and really expansive areas, enabling that rediscovery of culturally significant sites that might have been lost or hidden or overlooked over time. And this direct engagement really helps restore the connection to country and bring Indigenous knowledge systems, traditional ecological knowledge systems, back into the landscape, contributing to cultural revitalisation, but also our broader understanding of the ecosystem and our place within it. Importantly, I also think that these journeys create a space for shared learning across generations, where elders can pass on stories, cultural practices, and that place-based knowledge to younger community members, building stronger bonds within the Darug community, but also with external groups, including environmental groups or the government bodies responsible for these areas. And this ultimately strengthens community resilience, so an essential factor that we need in responding to major challenges like the extreme weather events of flooding in these regions. But beyond the individual and cultural benefits, this reconnection supports practical outcomes as well in identifying those priority sites for future works like bush regeneration and aquatic habitat restoration. And it also is going to contribute to that broader cultural restoration strategies led by DPRID, helping heal country whilst embedding Indigenous leadership and cultural priorities into that long-term environmental planning. And I think that's a really important thing that we're missing in natural asset management, is being able to embed Indigenous leadership and cultural priorities into that long-term planning. The second project that we were doing was at Hope Farm in Cat Eye National Park. This area was decimated by the floods and it had really extensive reshaping of the shoreline. So you can see on the left, before the floods, it had that nice little beach. Then after the flooding events that came in quite quick succession, it just had a little eddy and totally decimated that section of the riverbank. This also allowed the establishment of a significant number of weeds in the area. And the approach was to focus first on the most degraded areas along the river's edge to really demonstrate how the revegetation and remediation would work, and then build upon that in that first stage in continuing funding and activities through the cultural restoration strategy. A long-term goal was also to kind of reunite the patches of native vegetation that had become isolated from each other, which I think was a really important part of not only reconnecting with the area, but allowing the area to reconnect with itself. This location, when we went and checked it out, was covered in invasive species, and it has a really mixed up recent history with a carbon planting project that was undertaken a few years ago, and then the funding ran out and it was abandoned. And with all the climate variations that we've had and the floods, the trees, most of the trees that were planted have died off, and the machinery that the group had brought in to run the rip lines for the project was contaminated with invasive species like solanum and the golden crownbeard here. So lots of invasives were able to colonise this site. The invasive woody weeds that were present, like the box elders and the lantana, are being removed. And instead of just chucking them in the bin, they're being repurposed into cultural items. So a couple of the elders in the community are coming together to teach others how to use the wood from these invasive weeds to turn them into something new and something useful and something that captures that culture. This not only reduces, our impact on landfill, but it reconnects the community. The native species that are being used in the revegetation are sourced directly from the site. It's collected seed from that area to strengthen the biodiversity to help link up those remnant patches. And it also has the potential for this work to expand as the restoration strategy and as the coastal management program are adopted and enacted. So this initiative I really like as well. The other one is my favourite, but I still really find this one quite significant because it supports cultural and environmental restoration along the river by transforming the challenges of something like invasive woody weeds into an opportunity. So it's repurposing that weed wood into cultural items. And it's not only diverting that material from our green waste streams, it's reviving traditional crafting practices, which reinforces cultural identity and passes those skills on for future generations. So this process really links ecological restoration directly into cultural renewal, which enables healing of both land and people. The works also improve the physical and visual access to the river, which at the moment is completely inaccessible. And that access to the river was a point we spoke about earlier, where it's restricted a lot due to private land ownership. So to have somewhere that's public, but you can't get to the river anyway, is creating another barrier to being able to connect. So restoring these sight lines and access points was really vital for cultural connection because the river holds very deep spiritual and historical meaning for the Darug people. This work is also being done in collaboration with national parks, and that really helps foster that broader community engagement. So it allows learning across the different groups through that shared experience of being on country together and that storytelling. And that helps grow understanding and respect, because the more that you get to understand somebody else and their point of view, the more that you're able to respect where they're coming from and work together to reach something really, really positive. On the environmental level, the removal and reuse of those water-based weeds not only reduces the seed dispersal along the Hawkesbury, it also increases the resilience of the work that's being done at other sites, like at Wiseman's Ferry, where they were doing a revegetation work, getting the weeds out. And so by being able to reduce that weed load and being able to help with mitigating against flooding impacts at this end, it would then help those areas against future extreme weather events as well. So without these kinds of interventions, the site remains completely vulnerable to repeated degradation from flooding and other climate-driven impacts. And altogether, this kind of work really strengthens country. It strengthens it culturally and physically and ecologically, and showcases the power of integrated community-led restoration. So I just want to bring it back, looking back across the historical timeline, from the arrival of the first fleet to the scars left by colonisation and war and environmental exploitation. It's clear that the path past is not just behind us. It lives on in our bodies and our landscapes, in our families and our institutions. These events have shaped just my life in deeply personal ways through intergenerational trauma, environmental harm, and systemic racism embedded in our nation's foundations. And I've really come to appreciate how deeply history continues to echo in the present. So these moments, both personal and national, have instilled in me a profound sense of responsibility. And when I think about that and the project on Darubbin with Murrumbidgee, it's really part of my response and part of my responsibility. It's a deliberate effort to move beyond the business as usual approach that is too often overlooked or marginalised or even silenced First Nations voices. At its heart, I really feel that this work is grounded in listening, really listening to people and to country. It's based on respect and reciprocity and the understanding that Indigenous knowledge systems are not just relevant to today's challenges, they're essential to solving them. And when Indigenous people are not only involved in projects, but are central to the design and leadership, the outcomes are richer, they're more sustainable, they're more just. And I think country is not just land, it's kin, it's story, it's law, it's our teacher. And we need to ground our work in caring for country. And by doing that, we're not just repairing landscapes, we're rebuilding relationships. We are acknowledging that healing is not linear and that meaningful change takes time and trust and humility. And I think projects like this, when done with integrity and in genuine partnerships with Indigenous communities, really do have the power to heal wounds left by centuries of violence and disconnection. They create space for Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing to thrive, not in the margins, but at the centre of the decision making. And they're really bridging that now to next. The future significance of these projects, of this work, I think, can't be understated. These efforts can seed long-term transformation. Before, we just saw a few events and how they impacted just one person. I have no idea how these projects are going to impact people, but I think they're going to impact people in some really positive ways. I think we're going to see strengthening of community resilience, restoration of ecosystems, preservation of language and culture, and reweaving the bonds between people and place. And they can become living legacies, demonstrating what is possible when we move forward together with honesty, respect, and shared purpose. This project, I think, has really become more than a professional pursuit. It's a response to history, it's a commitment to justice, and a contribution to a more connected, compassionate, and sustainable future. And as I said, the impacts may not all be visible now, but they have the potential to echo far beyond our time, creating untold positive outcomes for future generations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. And so to create, I think, a project with what to me feels like this level of meaning, I had to do the work, and I don't mean the paperwork. I had to educate myself on the history of this region and understanding the context and people's lived experiences. I had to listen deeply, have deep conversations with no phones, no computers, no notes. But I think most importantly, it was about sitting by Darubbin. It was walking on Ngurra, and it was treating each other as if we were old friends. We can't undo the past wrongs, but we can forge a path forward together, bridging now to next. And I would really like to thank Uncle Wayne, Uncle Daryl and Jazz from Murrumbidgee. I would really like to thank Darubbin. It's been really impactful working with that river. I'm forever indebted to Uncle Bruce for everything he's ever done for me, and I would like to thank you all for listening.